I'm Washington correspondent Maddie Biertempfel. On this week's Capitol Conversations, we sat down with California Democratic Congressman Bera. He represents the state's 6th district, including Sacramento County. He weighs in on California's elections process after the Supreme Court ruled that mail-in ballots can be accepted after Election Day.
That said, we could look at other states that do have a faster process and maybe make some changes. But at the end of the day, it is about every eligible voter being able to vote.
His assessment of the Make America Healthy Again movement.
RFK Jr. scares me quite a bit. Some of what they've done around processed foods, making foods healthier, that's not a negative.
Plus, his reflections on America's 250th birthday, this 4th of July.
We're not a perfect nation, but we're still the best country in the world, where my parents could immigrate here in the 1950s. We could live the American dream.
And this Capitol Conversation starts with the Supreme Court's decision on mail-in ballots. What was your reaction to that ruling?
I mean, I'm glad that the Supreme Court reaffirmed that states are actually in charge of implementing elections. I think it would be a dangerous precedent for the federal government to take over elections. And again, I think the Constitution is pretty clear. It's up to the states to implement. Now, I will say, I hope California speeds up how they do count the ballots. I do like the fact that California does want every eligible voter to be able to vote. But again, I think we could do some things to make the ballot counting faster.
And that's something we've heard a target of President Trump, California's election laws, dealing with the speed it takes to get to results. I know some counties are still counting after the June 2nd primary. So what do you say to those who think that the length of time it takes sows distrust in the process?
You see that's what's happening in California. They're rigging the election.
President Trump putting out some of his comments creates an atmosphere of distrust. I think the fact that it does take us a long time may corroborate some of that. That said, the election workers are doing their jobs to make sure these are valid ballots before they get counted, and I think that's why it takes a fair amount of time. A lot of people in California vote as well. That said, we could look at other states that do have a faster process and maybe make some changes. But at the end of the day, it is about every eligible voter being able to vote.
And do you think Congress should make some of those changes, or should those be state-level decisions?
No, those are state-level decisions. Again, I firmly believe the election should be run by the states.
Okay. And the president and some Republicans have also kind of used this ruling to push the Save America Act, an elections law which currently lacks the votes in the Senate.
You have to be a citizen of our country. Okay, you have to show you're a citizen of our country, called citizenship. Voter ID by photo voter ID, and no mail-in ballots unless you're in the military, disabled, you're ill, or you're away, or even on a vacation. We're being very open about it. It's pretty easy. And we'll have honest elections.
I know you voted against this in the House. Why do you oppose it?
The Save America Act would disenfranchise a ton of voters, a lot of Republican voters. So it would require, if you're registering to vote, to be able to show a birth certificate, a passport. And again, those are not always going to line up. A lot of Americans don't have a passport. And again, it may disenfranchise really eligible voters, folks that have been voting for years. We've done multiple audits. In the 2020 election that President Trump refuted, still hasn't acknowledged that Joe Biden won that election. There were so many lawsuits, and there was very little evidence of voter fraud. So again, I think our goal should be every eligible American ought to vote. Right now, you saw the elections in New York last week, and voter turnout was really abysmal. We should want more Americans to vote, eligible votes.
And the Save America Act also held up that bill signing that the president was supposed to do last week, the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. It sounds like it may become law anyway, depending on what the president does. But can you talk about how this would help Americans buy a house and what you're hearing from constituents about their difficulties? Yeah,
this is a really good bill. It's bipartisan. A lot of hard work went into this bill. Republicans, hat off to French Hill, the chairman of the Financial Services Committee. We worked on 25 of the bills that were kind of put in here. It is going to streamline the building process. It'll allow more housing to get built. It's estimated that we may have a $6 million or $6 million house deficit in terms of how many homes we need to meet the demand. It also will, something I've been working on in Sacramento, looking at vacant lots that the government owns, making that available on a database. I pushed the city of Sacramento, the county of Sacramento to say, hey, you've got this property, why don't you partner with developers? You've got equity in here, let them build on this property, and let's do it fast and quick so folks can get in starter homes. So there's a lot of good stuff in here.
And what are people in your district telling you about, their experience just trying to buy a house and, what some of their challenges have been?
I mean, it's really challenging. So you don't have enough supply. The developers will say it just takes a long time to get the houses built, the zoning approved, so that adds a lot of cost. And then, it is just for, the mortgage payments have gone up for folks. So for a lot of young couples who feel like they've got good jobs, they want part of the American dream, there's just not enough housing supply out there. Other bills that we've been working on are, in California, a lot of folks bought their homes 40 years ago. They've lived there, they've raised their family, their kids are now gone, they're empty nesters, but their homes have really appreciated in value. The homeowner's tax exemption, which is capped at $250,000, hasn't changed for a long time. And in a state like California, that home may now be $1 million home. A lot of them are worried about selling it and getting hit by the taxes. So could we modernize that a little bit as well?
And you just talked about some of the measures within that bill. Is there any one in particular that you think will really make a big difference?
I mean, one for Sacramento, there is a prohibition on private equity investors coming in and buying up a lot of the rental housing stock. That happened during the Great Recession, where you saw some of these private equity firms come in and buy a lot of the housing in Sacramento. They've not put that back on the market. And I think the House and Senate did come to a nice middle ground here where you would have some rules that would prevent private equity and investors just coming up, buying up a bunch of homes. You'd set some caps. We do need that housing stock to come back on the market so folks can get in there and buy homes.
Coming up on the rest of this week's Capitol Conversations, we talk about the conflict in Iran and the White House's request for billions more dollars to cover the cost of it.
The main thrust of this is to pay for Operation Epic Fury needs.
When I hear the president asking for us to just wave a magic wand and come up with $88 billion, I'd sit there and say, what about those kids that can't eat lunch at school or get a free breakfast?
He also talks about what it's like in the minority party and working across the aisle.
What I've told Republicans is, like, look, I don't expect 50-50 legislation, but I'll meet you at the 35-yard line. But if you take it all the way to your own goal line, I'm not going to be able to vote for it. So let's negotiate.
I want to turn a little bit now to Iran. It's now been just over 4 months since that war started, and there's now supposed to be a ceasefire in place after the president signed a memorandum of understanding as negotiations play out. Do you have confidence that this draft deal, it seems the president signed, is going to have success, or how do you think that that's going to play out?
Look, I never thought we should have gotten in this war in the first place. We can go back and relitigate that in the future. We are where we are right now. I do think this is going to be a tenuous ceasefire. There's stops and starts. I'm glad that the Strait is starting to open up again. To me, the most important thing is, can you get the Strait open? Can you get those ships moving through there? Can you get relief for families who are really being shocked by the price of gasoline? That's probably the imminent thing here. And then I would urge the president to work with Congress, because this is going to be very difficult. We have to come up with a long-term solution to create peace and stability in the Middle East. I'd invite him to, or I'd ask him to bring the European allies in, to bring the Asian allies in, because they're going to have a very vested interest, along with the countries of the Middle East. So it is going to be a complicated negotiating process. I was in Congress when President Obama was negotiating the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. That took a long time, multiple meetings over and over again. Congress was very involved in the process, and ultimately I felt like we came out with a pretty good deal.
And the White House is asking for now $88 billion in supplemental spending to cover some of the costs of this war. When you hear that number in Congress, and obviously he needs to come to the House for the purse strings, what do you think of when he's asking for that?
I mean, when I hear the president asking for us to just wave a magic wand and come up with $88 billion, I'd sit there and say, what about those kids that can't eat lunch at school or get a free breakfast? What about those families that are struggling to put food on their table, all the benefits that you cut? What about the 4 million Americans that had to drop their health insurance coverage because they could no longer afford to pay the premium? You just wipe that away in H.R. 1. Now, all of a sudden, a war that you started, you want us to just give you $88 billion? I'll tell you what, let's make health insurance affordable. Let's put food on tables of families. Let's make sure our kids are fed every day, and then maybe we'll talk.
So you just mentioned health insurance and Americans losing a lot of their coverage, which kind of brings me to my next topic. I wanted to ask a little bit about your background, kind of how you got to Congress. If you could talk a little bit about your time as a doctor, chief medical officer for Sacramento, and then how you got from there to why you wanted to run for Congress.
I've always been interested in service, so never thought I was going to run for Congress. That wasn't my life goal. Went to medical school after undergrad, got married, moved up to Northern California to do my residency, and then eventually settled in Sacramento. And we've been there for 31 years. Practiced, as you said, was chief medical officer for Sacramento County. So really interested in how we get systems to work together to make sure every Sacramento resident had access to care if they got sick, and if they got really sick, they didn't have to worry about going bankrupt. We did some pretty innovative things while I was there, and then UC Davis recruited me over to be the Dean of Admissions at the medical school. So really loved teaching and training that next generation of doctor. President Obama was running in 2007, got interested in his campaign, got involved. He got elected. I knew he was going to work on healthcare and had this crazy notion of running for Congress. Did not get elected in 2010 when I first ran, but then did get elected in 2012. And that same value of making sure every American has access to healthcare, the ability to go see a doctor if they get sick, that still resonates with me. Nobody should not be able to do that, and they shouldn't have to worry about going bankrupt if they get really sick. And if we put in those terms, I think every American could probably agree that we should have basic access to healthcare coverage.
And that kind of answers this next question, but how has your experience as a doctor working with patients translated to some of the issues on Capitol Hill where there was big debate about ACA subsidies and all kinds of things it seems every day dealing with healthcare?
Look, I get the subsidies don't fundamentally reform things, they just lower the cost. That's a temporary measure. I think we do have to come up with basic coverage that says, okay, if you're a 25-year-old, here's what your basic coverage looks like. If you're a 50-year-old, here's what your coverage looks like, and the benefits that every American should have. After that, it should be up to the individual, their employer, to say, okay, well, I'd like to take my disposable income maybe buy a slightly richer policy or something else. But as a wealthy nation, we should make sure every American at least has basic access to coverage.
And you're also part of the Congressional Doctors Caucus, and I understand you've introduced some bills recently, last week dealing with abortion, one to fund programs for training where it's in states where it's legal, another that would protect doctors essentially. Can you talk about why you introduced these measures, why you think they're important?
Yeah, a fundamental right is that ability to choose your own decisions. When I entered healthcare, you take the Hippocratic Oath. That's to do good, to do no harm. But the third plank of that oath is patient autonomy. So my job is not to make healthcare decisions for you as my patient. It's to sit there, answer your questions, talk about the pros and cons and the upside and downside, and then empower you to make the decisions that matter to you. The reason why I'm 100% pro-choice is, my job is to empower the patient in front of me to make the decisions that resonate with their life circumstances, their family, their faith. I don't think the federal government should come in the exam room and make those decisions. And that could be said in any number of areas. Again, I think it's important to empower people to make the decisions, even if I agree or disagree with that decision. Ultimately, that's their decision.
And what's next for your legislation? Because, as you know, you've probably got an uphill battle here in Congress. I know some of the legislation involves the HHS secretary or DOJ, so the administration seems unlikely. But, you know, how do you hope to get people on board
Yeah,
with
I
this?
think we're going to keep pushing this legislation because it would be a shame if you were a family physician or an OBGYN in one state and you got a certain amount of training, and you were an OBGYN in a different state and you got more training. I think, again, this should be training that happens across the board. That's not the way it is right now, which is why we've introduced this legislation to allow folks, okay, well, I can't learn how to do this procedure in this state. Let me go over to this state where I can.
And also, kind of on the healthcare theme, the Trump administration has been pushing to what it says "Make America Healthy Again" with Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. They've changed the childhood vaccine schedule, changed the food pyramid, made all kinds of other changes as well. How do you assess what HHS has done?
You know, RFK Jr. scares me quite a bit because of not just his stance on vaccines. Vaccines are probably one of the greatest discoveries in human history with regards to healthcare, the number of lives that it saved. We eradicated smallpox, a disease that used to kill hundreds of thousands of individuals around this world every year. We can do that with so many other things. You know, we're on the verge of a malaria vaccine. You know, you have pretty effective HIV vaccines. This is technology that we should be investing more in, not discrediting. I do really worry about, you know, a disease like measles that we had made so much progress to the point where the United States was declared measles free. Measles is making a comeback, and you know, I get that we made some mistakes during the pandemic, during COVID-19, how we talked about vaccines, the vaccine mandates, and so forth. We could have done a better job in how we communicated and gave people choice. But at the end of the day, I trust the American patient. I think if you lay out the facts, empower them to make the decisions that fit with their life, their faith, they'll make the right decision.
And has there been anything the administration has done on that front that you think maybe has been helpful? I know there's been a push to, you know, get people to stop eating processed foods, take dyes out, that sort of thing. Do you think any of that has value?
Yeah, I do. You know, some of what they've done around processed foods, you know, making foods healthier, that's not a negative. Eating more fruits and vegetables. Not a raw milk guy. I have a little bit of issue with that. I just worry about some of the unprocessed exposure to bacteria and other things. But I do think, you know, some of those things, there's areas where we could work together.
And I also wanted to ask, moving ahead to the midterms, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries says he thinks Democrats can win back the House come November.
Over the last 18 months, Democrats across the country have won every single meaningful election against Republicans because Democrats are continuing to focus on the issues that matter, like fixing our broken healthcare system, lowering the high cost of living for everyday Americans, because this economy is suffocating people. They are drowning in the Trump economy, can't thrive, and can barely survive. And so as long as Democrats in the House, both our extraordinary frontline incumbents, as well as our red to blue candidates, continue to focus on the local issues that matter, anchored around the economy, the cost of living, and combating Trump Republican inflation, I remain confident, as we've done over the last 18 months, that Democrats will continue to win elections.
How do you think things would be different here if Democrats were in control of the House?
Yeah, so I'd love to say we're going to have a 30-seat majority. That's probably not the case. If we do get the majority, if we have a really good night, maybe it's a 7 to 10-seat majority. More likely we're a 5 to 7-seat majority. That means we're going to have to negotiate. I've argued that the best way to make Congress relevant again is to actually, you know, not work with the extremes, but work with, you know, those reasonable folks in the minority party that are willing to negotiate. And what I've told, I'm in the minority right now, what I've told Republicans is, like, look, I don't expect 50-50 legislation, but I'll meet you at the 35-yard line. But if you take it all the way to your own goal line, I'm not going to be able to vote for it. So let's negotiate. Let's find those areas where we have basic agreement and get stuff done. Now, where that happens is in the committees. You'll still see a lot of legislation that's bipartisan that comes out of committees. The problem is when it goes through the Rules Committee or tries to come to the floor, amendments get attached to it. It becomes a very partisan bill, and then it's one party, voting for it or voting against it. And that's not the way Congress used to work.
And being in the minority party now, what has it been like to try to work across the aisle? Do you find there is some spirit of bipartisanship? Because often, you see these committee hearings on TV, it's pretty contentious, but what's it like working across the aisle?
I mean, I'm in the minority, so I know the reality. If I want to get bills passed, I'm going to need Republican votes. So, and we're, a country that does have Democrats and Republicans, and we shouldn't just be one party rule. We should try to understand each other. We should try to figure out what's best for the United States of America.
And do you see any opportunities when it comes to working with the Trump administration or finding common ground with them?
I mean, it's interesting. One of the big bills we passed this Congress, I worked with Congresswoman Young Kim, a Republican from the state of California, on the Dominance Act, which is a bill around critical minerals, rare earths, something that's vital to EV technology, your cell phone, AI, semiconductors, et cetera. And we've seen that China does have a chokehold on the supply chain here. Not a partisan issue. We've written legislation that lines up pretty well with the Trump administration, passed it out of the House of Representatives with a unanimous vote. Senate's got a companion bill that they're moving through. So here's a rare instance where, hey, here's something bipartisan we can agree on. We've looked at what the Trump administration wants to do. It all lines up. The housing bill is another great example of that.
And lastly, as we wrap up this week, it's going to be the 4th of July, America's 250th birthday. There's been a lot of debate over the organizations that are putting on some of the events. We've seen Freedom 250, which is kind of the Trump administration linked one, versus America 250. What do you make of kind of, celebrating the country's birthday, but also some of the politics that seems to have been in it?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that something that should be a huge celebration for all of us that love the country that we live in, the United States of America, at its 250th birthday, aren't all coming together to just celebrate who we are as the United States of America, to make this about one person, in this case President Trump, or one party versus the other party. That's unfortunate. I was a kid during the bicentennial when America turned 200, and you saw none of this. It was just a celebration of who we are as Americans. I hope one day we can get back to that.
And then lastly, what are your 4th of July plans, and what does America mean to you?
4th of July is for community, country, family, barbecues, parades, things like that. So I'll probably have a low-key 4th of July back home in California. And what America means to me is we're not a perfect nation, but we're still the best country in the world, where my parents could immigrate here in the 1950s. We could live the American dream. And I just hope for that for the next generation. We're this tapestry of folks that came here seeking a better life, one generation after another, one culture bringing your traditions, your religions. It's all woven together in this fabulous tapestry that is the United States of America.
Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Thanks.
And that's all for this week's Capitol Conversations. For more news like this, be sure to check out the other videos on this app. In Washington, I'm Maddie Biertempfel.